Imagine a world where a single bad week of rain doesn't just mean higher prices at the grocery store. It means your entire town starves to death. In 1840, the American farmer was a gambler, playing a high-stakes game against nature with nothing but a wooden plow and a prayer. But over the next 20 years, a series of radical laws, bloody conflicts, and miracle machines would transform the United States from a struggling collection of fields into the breadbasket of the world. This isn't just a story of crops, it's the story of how land became power and how that power nearly tore a nation apart. The Iron Frontier and the death of the wooden plow. The year is 1842. In the American Midwest, the soil is black gold, rich, thick, and incredibly fertile. But there is a problem. The earth is so heavy and sticky that it clings to traditional iron and wooden plows like wet concrete. Farmers are breaking their backs and their spirits trying to clear just a few acres. The breaking point. For decades, agricultural policy was simple: go west, young man. But the policy was failing because the technology couldn't keep up with the geography. The federal government had millions of acres of public land, but without a way to tarnish the tough prairie sod, that land was useless. The economy of the entire frontier was stalled. Enter the singing plow. In a small forge in Illinois, a blacksmith named John Deere is watching the frustration of his neighbors. He realizes that the cast iron plows brought from the East Coast are designed for sandy soil, not the thick loam of the Mississippi Valley. In a moment of genius, he takes a broken steel saw blade and fashions a new kind of plow. When he drops it into the earth, something miraculous happens. The soil doesn't stick. The steel scours itself clean as it moves. It moves so smoothly through the earth that it creates a humming sound. The singing plow. The policy shift from survival to surplus. This invention changes the conversation in Washington, D.C. Suddenly, the great American desert is seen as a gold mine. Politicians begin debating the Preemption Act, a policy that allows squatters who had already settled on land to buy it cheaply before it's auctioned to wealthy speculators. The message from the government was clear: if you can tame the land, you can keep it. But as thousands of settlers began flooding west with their new steel plows, they were heading straight into a collision course with two massive forces: the indigenous tribes who called that land home, and a southern political machine that realized every new free farm in the West was a threat to the slave-holding plantation system. The soil was being turned, but the seeds of a great conflict were being planted right alongside the wheat. While John Deere was conquering the soil beneath the feet of the pioneers, another revolution was brewing that would change the visual landscape of America forever. By 1847, the problem wasn't just planting anymore, it was the harvest. The race against rot. In the mid-1840s, a farmer could plant more than he could ever hope to harvest. Wheat has a golden window, a period of only about 10 days when it is perfectly ripe. If it isn't cut by then, it rots in the field or shatters in the wind. Using a handheld cradle scythe, the strongest man could only harvest about 2 acres a day. This physical limitation acted as a ceiling on American growth. No matter how much land the government gave away, a farm could be only as big as a man's physical endurance. Cyrus McCormick's gamble. He moved from Virginia to Chicago, a swampy, rising town, with a design for a horse-drawn mechanical reaper. It was a clattering, terrifying machine of iron and wood, but it did the work of 10 men. However, McCormick wasn't just an inventor, he was a master of financial policy. He realized that even though his machine cost $100, a fortune for a pioneer, he could sell it on credit. This was a radical concept for the time. By allowing farmers to pay for the machine using the profits of future harvests, he effectively tied the American farmer to the global market. The farmer was no longer just a subsistence worker. He was an entrepreneur with debt, a deadline, and a high-tech machine. The great political divide: wheat versus cotton. As McCormick's reapers began to hum across the North and the West, a dangerous geopolitical shift occurred. In the South, the economy was tied to manual labor, slavery, and cotton. In the North and West, the economy was shifting towards mechanical labor and wheat. Southern politicians in Washington watched this with growing dread. They realized that agricultural policy was becoming a weapon. If the federal government passed the Homestead Act, a proposed law to give 160 acres of land for free to any citizen, it would fill the West with small, mechanized wheat farms. These farmers wouldn't need slaves. They had McCormick reapers. To the South, the free soil movement wasn't just about morality. It was an existential threat to their economic survival. Every time a new mechanical reaper was sold in Iowa or Wisconsin, the political power of the slave-holding South grew weaker. The 1850 crisis. By 1850, the tension reached a breaking point. The government was desperate to keep the Union together, but the dirt didn't lie. The North was industrializing its food supply, while the South remained frozen in a plantation model. The reaper was doing more than cutting wheat. It was cutting the ties between the North and South, creating two different Americas that could no longer speak the same language. The stage was set for a decade of bloody Kansas, where the question of what kind of agriculture would rule the West would be decided not by policy, but by gunpowder. Chapter 3: The Soil of Discord and the Ghost of Kansas. By 1854, the American dream of a peaceful pastoral expansion was dead. The federal government, desperate to organize new territories for a transcontinental railroad, passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This policy didn't just open land, it lit a fuse. It overturned the old Missouri Compromise and declared that the settlers themselves would vote on whether their state would be free or slave. This was the birth of popular sovereignty, but on the ground it was an invitation to a massacre. The rush for the border. The act of farming turned into an act of war. Abolitionist groups in New England formed the New England Emigrant Aid Company, shipping thousands of anti-slavery farmers to Kansas, armed not just with plows, but with Beecher's Bibles, a code name for Sharp's rifles. On the other side, border ruffians from the slave state of Missouri crossed the line to burn haystacks, steal livestock, and intimidate anyone who wanted to build a farm without slaves. The agricultural policy of the United States had effectively turned the frontier into a giant bloody chessboard. The death of the gentleman farmer. In Washington, the halls of power were just as violent. When Senator Charles Sumner gave a speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas," attacking the pro-slavery push for land, he was beaten nearly to death on the Senate floor. The policy debate had moved beyond economics. It was now about the identity of the American Earth. The Northern vision, a landscape of small 160-acre family farms, highly educated, using the latest steam-powered threshers and steel plows. The Southern vision, a landscape of vast, sprawling estates, where land was a status symbol, worked by forced labor, resisting the soulless industrialization of the North. The 1850 economic earthquake. While men were dying in the Kansas tallgrass, a financial panic hit the nation. The 1857 panic was the first global economic crisis, and it proved a terrifying point. The American farmer was now part of a global machine. When grain prices crashed, the northern farmers, who had taken out massive loans to buy McCormick reapers and John Deere plows, found themselves drowning in debt. The South, however, stayed afloat because the world still craved their cotton. This gave the South a false sense of security. They began to believe King Cotton was invincible and that they didn't need the North's machines or the North's policies. A new prophet of the soil. Amidst this chaos, a tall, lanky lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln began to gain traction. He didn't just talk about the morality of slavery, he talked about the policy of opportunity. He argued that a man should be able to work his own land and keep the fruits of his own labor. Lincoln's message was the ultimate agricultural hook. The land belongs to those who work it, not those who own the people who work it. As the 1850s drew to a close, the Kansas question remained soaked in blood. The government could no longer compromise. The next policy passed wouldn't be signed in ink, it would be signed in the fire of the coming Civil War. In 1862, the United States was bleeding. The Civil War was raging, and the Union was far from certain of victory. But while the headlines were filled with the smoke of Bull Run and Shiloh, a silent revolution was happening in the halls of a half-empty Washington, D.C. With the Southern Democrats gone from Congress, the Northern Republicans did something staggering. In a single year, they passed 3 pieces of legislation that would do more to shape the modern world than almost any battle in history. They called it the Triple Crown of agricultural policy. 1. The Homestead Act, the great land giveaway. For decades, the South had blocked this law. But on May 20th, 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act into law. The deal was simple. The government would give any citizen, including women and former slaves, 160 acres of public land for free. All they had to do was live on it for 5 years, build a house, and grow crops. It was the greatest redistribution of wealth in human history. Overnight, the common man became a landowner. This policy didn't just fill the West, it acted as a giant vacuum, sucking millions of immigrants from Europe toward the American prairie. They weren't just looking for freedom, they were looking for dirt. 2. The Morrill Act, the democracy of brains. Lincoln and his allies knew that giving people land wasn't enough. They had to know how to use it. On July 2, 1862, the Morrill Land Grant Acts were passed. The federal government gave millions of acres to the states, not for farming, but to sell to fund agricultural and mechanical colleges. Before this, college was for lawyers and priests. Now, the government was declaring that farming was a science. These land-grant universities, like Michigan State, Kansas State, and Rutgers, were built to turn the son of a pioneer into a scientist who understood soil chemistry and crop rotation. It was the birth of the American high-tech farmer. Finally, Lincoln established the United States Department of Agriculture. He called it the People's Department. At a time when 90% of Americans were farmers, this wasn't just another agency, it was the nerve center of the economy. The USDA began collecting seeds from around the world, testing which ones could survive the harsh winters of the Dakotas or the heat of the plains. The hidden war strategy. There was a cold, hard strategy behind these policies. While the South was burning its cotton to keep it out of British hands, the North was using these laws to flood the world with cheap wheat. As the war dragged on, Europe faced a series of crop failures. Britain had to choose. Do they support the South for its cotton or the North for its bread? Thanks to the policies of 1862, the North was producing so much grain that the British couldn't afford to intervene. Wheat defeated cotton. The mechanical reaper and the Homestead Act proved more powerful than the cannon. The American farmer had become the Union's secret weapon. But as the war drew to a close, a new question arose. What would happen to the millions of newly freed slaves in the South? Would they get their 160 acres, or was the American dream of land only meant for some? As the smoke cleared from the battlefields of the Civil War in 1865, the United States faced its most harrowing question. How do you integrate 4 million newly freed people into an economy built on their exploitation? The answer, many believed, lay in the very thing that had built the nation, land. The field order that changed everything. In January 1865, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman met with 20 black community leaders in Savannah, Georgia. He asked them what they needed to maintain their freedom. Their answer was unanimous: land. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. Days later, Sherman issued Special Field Orders Number 15. It set aside a massive strip of coastline from South Carolina to Florida, roughly 400,000 acres, to be divided into 40-acre plots for newly freed families. Later, the Army began lending out broken-down mules to help them plow. This was the origin of the legendary phrase, 40 acres and a mule. The Freedmen's Bureau. To manage this transition, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau. This was a radical experiment in social policy. The Bureau was authorized to lease out abandoned and confiscated Confederate land to former slaves. For the first time in history, the people who had bled for the soil were finally going to own it. By the summer of 1865, nearly 40,000 freedmen were working their own farms. They were building schools, churches, and a future. The Great Betrayal. But the dream was short-lived. After Lincoln's assassination, his successor, Andrew Johnson, a Southerner with little sympathy for the freedmen, orchestrated a devastating policy reversal. Johnson issued a series of sweeping pardons to former Confederate landowners. The policy shift was brutal. The land was to be returned to the original rebels. Federal agents, the same ones who had promised the land to the freedmen, were forced to tell families they had to leave their new homes or sign labor contracts to work for their former masters. The 40 acres were snatched back, and with them, the hope of economic independence. The rise of sharecropping. With no land of their own and no capital, black farmers were forced into a new predatory system, sharecropping. Under this policy by default, a landowner provided the land, seed, and tools, while the farmer provided the labor. At harvest time, the landowner took half or more of the crop. Because the farmers had to buy food and clothes on credit from the landowner's store at high interest rates, they ended the year in debt. This was debt peonage, slavery by another name, enforced not by whips, but by accounting ledgers. The legacy of the mid-century. By 1868, the American map of agriculture was split. The North and West were exploding with independent, mechanized family farms backed by the Homestead Act. The South, however, was sinking into a cycle of poverty and cotton dependency that would last for a century. The mid-19th century agricultural policies had created an empire of wheat and a technological marvel in the North, but in the South, they had failed to secure the fundamental right of ownership for those who had worked the land the longest. The golden age of American farming was starting, but it was a gold that didn't shine for everyone. Chapter 6: The Steam Giants and the Birth of Industrial Food. As the 1860s drew to a close, the American landscape looked like something out of a science fiction novel. The quiet, pastoral life of the early 1800s was dead. In its place was a loud, smoking, metal-clanking machine that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This was the era of the steam revolution, the final piece of the mid-19th century puzzle. The iron horse and the global market. The most significant agricultural policy of the late 1860s wasn't about seeds or soil. It was about steel rails. The Pacific Railway Act had funneled massive amounts of land and money to railway companies. By 1869, the Transcontinental Railway was complete. Before this, a farmer in Nebraska could grow a mountain of grain, but he had no way to sell it to someone in New York or London without it rotting. Now, the railway acted as a giant vacuum, sucking up the surplus of the West and dumping it into the ports of the East. For the first time, the local farmer was dead. Every farmer was now a global player, competing with grain prices in Russia and India. Steam power, the monsters in the field. The human back had officially reached its limit. To keep up with the global demand, farmers began to adopt steam traction engines. These were massive coal-fired behemoths that looked like locomotives that had wandered off the tracks and into the dirt. These engines powered threshing machines that could process thousands of bushels of grain in a single day, work that would have taken an entire village weeks to do by hand. The scale of farming shifted from acres to territories. This was the birth of agribusiness. Agriculture was no longer a way of life. It was a factory system without a roof. The 1867 Grange. The farmers fight back. As the decade closed, the policy shifted again, this time from the government to the people. Farmers realized that while they were producing more food than ever before, the railroads and the middlemen were taking all the profit. In 1867, the Patrons of Husbandry were formed. This was the first major agricultural lobby in U.S. history. They fought for Granger laws to regulate rising railroad prices. They proved that the American farmer was no longer a lonely pioneer. They were a political force that could make. By 1870, the American experiment in agricultural policy had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams or nightmares. The combination of the Homestead Act, steam-powered machinery, and the railroad had turned the Great Plains into a grain-producing factory of unprecedented scale. But this success was about to trigger a global crisis: the European shockwave. As American wheat flooded the Atlantic in iron-hulled steamships, the price of grain in Europe plummeted. The mid-century American policies didn't just affect American farmers, they broke the back of European feudalism. Peasant farmers in Germany, Italy, and Scandinavia couldn't compete with the cheap homestead wheat. This triggered one of the largest migrations in human history. Millions of Europeans abandoned their ancestral lands and bought one-way tickets to New York, heading west to become the very American farmers who were undercutting them. The dust of progress. There was a hidden ecological cost to the singing plow of the 1840s. By ripping up the deep, tangled root systems of the prairie grass to plant endless rows of wheat, farmers had inadvertently removed the glue that held the continent together. The policies of the mid-19th century focused entirely on production, with zero thought for conservation. The seeds of the 1930s Dust Bowl were actually sown in the 1860s. The soil that had been built over 10,000 years was being used up in a single generation of high-intensity farming. The final tally. Looking back at this 30-year explosion, we see a complete transformation of the human experience. In 1840, a farmer feeds 3 to 4 people. In 1870, a single farmer, equipped with a steel plow, a McCormick reaper, and a steam thresher, feeds 15 to 20 people. This surplus labor is what allowed the United States to build its great cities. People weren't needed on the farm anymore, so they moved to Chicago, Detroit, and New York to work in the new factories. Agriculture didn't just feed the Industrial Revolution, it created the workforce that built it. Conclusion: the soil is a document. The mid-19th century taught us that land is the ultimate political currency. From the blood-soaked fields of Kansas to the 40 acres that were promised and then stolen, every policy was a choice about who gets to be a citizen. The American farmer became the hero of a new national mythology, the rugged individualist taming the wild. But behind that myth was a massive, complex network of government land grants, federal scientific research, and corporate railroad subsidies. The self-made farmer was actually the product of the most aggressive and successful government economic planning in history. To understand the 19th century farmer, you have to understand the metal in his hands. The policies written in Washington were just ink until they were forged into iron in the heartland. This is the story of the transition from muscle to machine.
the evolution of the blade. In 1840, a plow was essentially a heavy triangle of wood tipped with a bit of iron. It was a killing machine, not for the soil, but for the oxen and the men pulling it. By 1860, the sulky plow appeared. For the first time, a farmer could sit down while he worked. To the traditionalist, this was lazy. To the economist, it was a revolution. A sitting farmer could work longer hours, cover more ground, and manage the massive 160-acre plots granted by the Homestead Act. The thresher, the village destroyer. Before the mid-19th century, separating grain from the stalk was a communal, winter-long task. You used a flail, 2 sticks joined by a chain, and beat the wheat on a barn floor. It was slow, dusty, and miserable. The arrival of the Pitts thresher changed the social fabric of America. These were massive stationary machines powered by horsepowers, literal circles of horses walking in a ring. Suddenly, the work of a whole village for a month could be done in an afternoon. This killed the need for large communal labor forces and shifted the power to the individual who owned the machine. The seed drill, precision over luck. For thousands of years, humans planted by broadcasting, literally throwing seeds by hand and hoping they landed in the right spot. It was incredibly wasteful. The mid-century saw the perfection of the mechanical seed drill. This machine used gears and tubes to drop seeds at exact intervals and exact depths. This wasn't just a convenience, it was a survival strategy. In the harsh, dry climates of the newly opened Western territories, a seed planted too shallow would die in the sun. The seed drill ensured that the great American desert actually produced a harvest. The final transformation, the combine dream.
By 1872, the map of the United States had been transformed into a giant grid. To the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., the West was a series of neat 160-acre squares. But to the families moving into the great American desert, the reality was a violent, lonely struggle for survival that no law book could prepare them for. The sod house and the price of loneliness. The Homestead Act gave the land for free, but it didn't give the lumber to build a house. On the vast prairies of Kansas and Nebraska, there were no trees. To follow the law and improve the land, families had to become sod busters. They took John Deere's steel plow and cut the thick prairie grass into bricks of dirt, stacking them to create sod houses. These were dark, damp, and infested with snakes and insects. During a rainstorm, the roof would drip mud into the soup pot for days. This was the American dream in its rawest form. A family living in a hole in the ground, surrounded by 1,000 miles of grass, betting their lives that the rain would fall and the prices would stay high. The locust plague of 1874. Just as the mid-century policies had pushed millions of people onto the plains, nature struck back with a biblical fury. In 1874, a heat wave triggered the Great Locust Plague. A cloud of grasshoppers, 1,800 miles long and 100 miles wide, descended from the sky. They didn't just eat the wheat, they ate everything. They ate the wool off the backs of living sheep. They ate the wooden handles of the McCormick reapers. They even ate the clothes off the backs of the farmers. In a single afternoon, the work of a decade was vanished. The federal government, which had been so eager to give away the land, was slow to provide aid. For the first time, the homesteaders realized they were on their own. The anatomy of the debt trap. This is where the story gets dark. To survive the locusts or a bad drought, the farmer needed cash, but there were no banks on the frontier. Instead, the farmer turned to land sharks, private lenders who charged interest rates as high as 25% or 40%. The agricultural policy of the era had encouraged farmers to buy expensive machinery, threshers, drills, and reapers on credit. Now, the farmer was trapped. To pay the debt, he had to grow more wheat.
To grow more wheat, he needed more machinery. To buy more machinery, he needed more debt. The farmer was no longer a free man. He was a servant to the Eastern money interests. The railroads, which were given millions of acres by the government for free, were now charging the farmers more to ship a bushel of grain than the grain was actually worth. The birth of the populist fire. In the flickering candlelight of those sod houses, a new movement was born out of pure rage. Farmers began to realize that the laws passed in 1862, the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act, had been designed to build an empire, not necessarily to protect the citizen. They began to organize cooperatives. They shared machinery, they built their own grain elevators, and they began to demand that the government regulate the railroads. This was the beginning of the populist movement. These farmers, who had been told they were the backbone of the nation, were now being called radicals and socialists in the newspapers in New York. The ghost of the frontier. As the mid-century came to a close, the frontier was officially declared closed. There was no more free land to give. The policy of expansion had hit the Pacific Ocean. The result was a new kind of America. We had the highest agricultural production in the world, but we also had a massive class of tenant farmers, people who worked the land but owned nothing. The Jeffersonian vision of a nation of independent farmers had been replaced by a nation of industrial producers. The soil was now a factory floor, the farmer was now a laborer, and the government in Washington was now the referee in a high-stakes game between the people who grew the food and the corporations that sold it. By the late 1870s, the agricultural policy of the United States had moved from the quiet wheat fields of Kansas into the bloody, chaotic heart of Chicago. The mid-century revolution had been so successful at producing surplus animals and grain that the country now faced a terrifying new problem: scale. How do you manage the health, safety, and sale of 10 million cattle moving across a continent? The answer would lead to a brutal war between the beef barons and the federal government. The city of slaughter. Chicago was the great central market. Thanks to the railroad policies of the 1860s, every track led to the Union stockyards. This was a city within a city, a square mile of pens, chutes, and wooden walkways filled with 500,000 animals at any given time. Industrialists like Gustavus Swift and Pilham Armour realized that the old way of shipping live cattle to the East Coast was wasteful. You were paying to ship the bones, the hide, and the water weight. Their solution was the disassembly line. They brought the factory system to the animal. A cow would enter the building alive and 30 minutes later be turned into steaks, glue, fertilizer, and hairbrushes. The policy of nothing wasted of these corporations was simple: use everything but the squeal. This efficiency made meat cheap for the first time in human history. The average American worker could now eat beef every day, something a European peasant couldn't imagine. But there was a dark side. Because there were no federal inspectors and no food safety laws, the conditions were nightmarish. To keep profits high and costs low, diseased meat was often mixed into sausages. Chemicals like borax and formaldehyde were used to freshen rotting meat. The government had spent 30 years helping farmers grow more, but they had spent 0 years making sure that food was safe. In the late 1870s, a chemist at the USDA named Harvey Washington Wiley began a crusade. He saw that the industrialization of agriculture had turned the American kitchen into a laboratory of poisons. He formed what became known as the Poison Squad, a group of young men who volunteered to eat common food additives to see if they would die or get sick. This was the beginning of a massive policy shift, the move from quantity to quality. The public began to demand that the USDA do more than just hand out seeds. They wanted the government to police the plate. The cattle plague and the first Iron Curtain. While Wiley was fighting in the lab, a deadly disease called contagious pleuropneumonia began sweeping through American cattle. This triggered the first international agricultural trade war. Great Britain, fearing the American plague, banned the import of all U.S. cattle. This was a catastrophe. The American economy depended on those exports. For the first time, the U.S. government realized that policy wasn't just about domestic land, it was about international reputation. In 1884, Congress created the Bureau of Animal Industry. This agency was given the power to quarantine states, kill diseased animals, and inspect the meatpacking plants. The death of the cowboy. As the government stepped in to regulate the health of the herds, the Wild West era of the cowboy came to a crashing halt. The open range policy, where cattle roamed free over millions of acres, was replaced by barbed wire. Invented in 1874, barbed wire was the ultimate agricultural policy in physical form. It allowed the government and the railroad companies to divide the land into private property that could be controlled and taxed. It ended the long drive from Texas to Kansas. The cowboy, once the symbol of American freedom, was now just a ranch hand, fixing fences and working for a corporation. The new frontier, the lab. By 1879, the focus of the USDA and the land grant colleges had shifted. They weren't just teaching men how to plow, they were teaching them bacteriology. The golden age of the pioneer was being replaced by the age of the expert. The American farm was no longer a wilderness, it was a scientifically managed resource. The mid-century started with a man and a horse. It was ending with a scientist and a microscope. The foundation was laid for the 20th century, an era where America wouldn't just be a country, but a global food superpower. Chapter 13. The Sky Turns to Brass, the Great Collapse of 1887. For 20 years, the American government and the railroad companies had lied to the people. They had used a pseudo-scientific theory called rain follows the plow. They told settlers that by simply breaking the sod and planting crops, they would change the climate of the Great Plains, that the moisture from the disturbed earth would rise up and create rain. In the mid-1880s, the sky finally called their bluff. The illusion of abundance. From 1878 to 1886, the West experienced unusually high rainfall. It was a golden era of deceptive weather. Encouraged by federal policy, hundreds of thousands of families pushed past the 100th meridian, the invisible line where the climate becomes arid. They planted corn and wheat in places that were naturally meant to be short grass prairies. Towns sprung up overnight. Land prices skyrocketed. Banks in the East poured millions of dollars into Western mortgages, believing the plains were a garden that would never wilt. The USDA even distributed seeds for crops that required massive amounts of water, further fueled.
Chapter 14. The Final Fence, 1890, and the Birth of the Angry Farmer. By 1890, the American landscape had reached a psychological and political breaking point. For 50 years, the frontier had acted as a pressure valve for the United States. If life was too hard in the East, if your factory job was too oppressive, or if you were an immigrant looking for a start, you could always go west. But in 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau issued a statement that sent a shiver through the American soul. The frontier was officially closed. There was no longer a discernible line of settlement. Every acre of usable land had been claimed, fenced, or fought over. The great betrayal of the independent farmer. As the land ran out, the mid-19th century policies that were supposed to create a nation of equals began to look like a rigged game. The farmers, the men and women who had survived the locusts of '74 and the droughts of '87, looked at their bank accounts and saw nothing but red ink. They were producing more wheat, corn, and cotton than ever before in human history. By all rights, they should have been the richest people on earth. Instead, they were the poorest. Because of the deflationary policy of the federal government, the gold standard, the price of crops kept falling. A farmer had to grow twice as much wheat in 1890 just to pay back a loan he took out in 1880. The railroad tyranny. The railroads, which had been built with taxpayer-funded land grants, were now the great octopuses of the plains. They owned the grain elevators. They owned the storage sheds. If a farmer wanted to sell his grain, he had to pay whatever price the railroad demanded. It was a policy of extortion. In many cases, it was cheaper for a farmer to burn his corn for fuel than to pay the railroad to ship it to market. The steel rails of progress from the 1860s had become the iron shackles of the 1890s. The rise of the People's Party, populism. This was the moment the American farmer stopped being a pioneer and started being a revolutionary. In schoolhouses and hay barns across the Midwest and the South, millions of farmers joined the Farmers Alliance. They didn't just want better seeds from the USDA, they wanted to take over the government. They formed the People's Party, or the Populists. Their demands were radical for the time. Government ownership of railroads, an income tax on the wealthy, the direct election of senators, a sub-treasury plan, a policy where the government would build warehouses for farmers to store their crops and provide low-interest loans based on those crops. The battle of the standards, gold versus silver. The agricultural war of the mid-19th century culminated in the most famous political speech in American history. In 1896, William Jennings Bryan, the champion of the farmers, took the stage at the Democratic National Convention. He attacked the Eastern bankers and the pro-gold policies that were crushing the rural heartland. His voice boomed across the hall. "Ye shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. Ye shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The farmers wanted free silver, a policy that would increase the money supply and raise crop prices. They were fighting for the very survival of the family farm against the industrial machine. The legacy, the foundation of modern America. The Populists eventually lost the election of 1896, but they won the long war of history. Almost every policy they fought for, the income tax, the regulation of monopolies, and government support for crop prices, became the law of the land in the 20th century. The mid-19th century agricultural policies had done their job. They had conquered a continent and built a superpower. But they had also created a massive permanent tension between the rural heart and the urban power of America. Conclusion: the soil never forgets. As we look back at this 50-year epic, we see that the American dirt is more than just earth. It is a record of our ambitions, our greed, and our resilience. The singing plow, the mechanical reaper, and the Homestead Act were the tools that carved a new kind of civilization out of the wilderness. The mid-19th century agriculture taught us that you cannot build a democracy on empty stomachs, but you also cannot build a lasting society if you treat the land and the people who work it as nothing more than a line on a balance sheet. As the 19th century drew to a close, the era of the lonesome pioneer had ended, but a new, quieter revolution was beginning inside the laboratories of the United States Department of Agriculture. The government realized that to feed a nation that was now 76 million people strong, they couldn't just rely on more land, they had to rely on more science. The seed spies. In the late 1990s, the USDA launched one of its most fascinating policies, the Section of Seed and Plant Introduction. They hired plant explorers, essentially agricultural spies, and sent them to the most remote corners of the globe. Men like David Fairchild traveled to Russia, China, and the Middle East to find crops that could survive the impossible climates of America. They brought back durum wheat from the Russian steppes, which allowed the U.S. to dominate the pasta and bread markets, and soybeans from Asia. These weren't just seeds, they were the genetic blueprints for a new American empire. The battle for soil chemistry. While spies were hunting for seeds, scientists back home were solving a terrifying mystery. Why was the soil dying? In the South, Decades of planting nothing but cotton and tobacco had sucked the nutrients out of the earth. The land was exhausted. Under the Hatch Act of 1887, the government funded agricultural experiment stations in each state. It was here that researchers like George Washington Carver began to change the world. Though his most famous work happened slightly later, the foundation was laid in this era of agricultural extension. They taught farmers that the soil was a living thing that needed to be fed. They introduced crop rotation, planting peanuts or clover to put nitrogen back into the soil that cotton had stolen. This wasn't just a farming tip, it was a federal policy of national survival. The rise of the Aggie culture. By 1900, the Morrill land-grant colleges had come of age. They had produced a new class of Americans, the Aggies. These were young men and women who viewed farming not as a tradition passed down from a father, but as a profession governed by physics and chemistry. The policy shift was massive. The government began sending demonstration trains across the country. These were mobile laboratories on rails that would stop in rural towns. Scientists would step off the train and show skeptical farmers how to test their soil for acidity or how to spot the larvae of the Hessian fly under a microscope. The industrialization of the soul. But this scientific triumph came with a heavy cost. As farming became a science, it also became an expense. To use the new seeds and the new chemical fertilizers, you needed capital. The small 160-acre family farm, the dream of the 1862 Homestead Act, was becoming inefficient. The policy was inadvertently favoring the great farmer. The USDA's research was most easily applied to large-scale operations. The family farm was being replaced by the agri-corporation. The final horizon. The mid-19th century started with a man, a wooden plow, and an endless, untamed horizon. It ended in an era of concrete dams, steam-powered threshers, and global commodity markets. The mid-19th century agricultural policies were never just about growing food. It was a 60-year campaign to turn the North American continent into the most efficient, high-output engine of production in human history. The result, by 1905, the United States was no longer just a nation of farmers. It was the world's first agricultural superpower. The hunger that had plagued humanity for thousands of years was being defeated by American soil, American steel, and American policy. Outro for your series. The story of the 19th century farm is the story of America itself. It is a tale of incredible ingenuity and heartbreaking greed, of miracle machines and broken promises, of a people who looked at a vast, wild continent and decided to turn it into a garden. We live in the shadow of these giants. Every time you see a massive field of corn stretching to the horizon, or a canal cutting through a desert, you are seeing the ghost of a policy written in 1862. The frontier may be closed, but the harvest never ends. By 1870, the American experiment in agricultural policy had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams or nightmares. The combination of the Homestead Act, steam-powered machinery, and the railroad had turned the Great Plains into a grain-producing factory of unprecedented scale. But this success was about to trigger a global crisis. The European shockwave. As American wheat flooded the Atlantic in iron-hulled steamships, the price of grain in Europe plummeted. The mid-century American policies didn't just affect American farmers, they broke the back of European feudalism. Peasant farmers in Germany, Italy, and Scandinavia couldn't compete with the cheap homestead wheat. This triggered one of the largest migrations in human history. Millions of Europeans abandoned their ancestral lands and bought one-way tickets to New York, heading west to become the very American farmers who were undercutting them. The dust of progress.
There was a hidden ecological cost to the singing plow of the 1840s. By ripping up the deep, tangled root systems of the prairie grass to plant endless rows of wheat, farmers had inadvertently removed the glue that held the continent together. The policies of the mid-19th century focused entirely on production, with zero thought for conservation. The seeds of the 1930s Dust Bowl were actually sown in the 1860s. The soil that had been built over 10,000 years was being used up in a single generation of high-intensity farming. The final tally. Looking back at this 30-year explosion, we see a complete transformation of the human experience. In 1840, a farmer feeds 3 to 4 people. In 1870, a single farmer, equipped with a steel plow, a McCormick reaper, and a steam thresher, feeds 15 to 20 people. This surplus labor is what allowed the United States to build its great cities. People weren't needed on the farm anymore, so they moved to Chicago, Detroit, and New York to work in the new factories. Agriculture didn't just feed the Industrial Revolution, it created the workforce that built it. Conclusion: the soil is a document. The mid-19th century taught us that land is the ultimate political currency. From the blood-soaked fields of Kansas to the 40 acres that were promised and then stolen, every policy was a choice about who gets to be a citizen. The American farmer became the hero of a new national mythology, the rugged individualist taming the wild. But behind that myth was a massive, complex network of government land grants, federal scientific research, and corporate railroad subsidies. The self-made farmer was actually the product of the most aggressive and successful government economic planning in history. To understand the 19th century farmer, you have to understand the metal in his hands. The policies written in Washington were just ink until they were forged into iron in the heartland. This is the story of the transition from muscle to machine. The evolution of the blade. In 1840, a plow was essentially a heavy triangle of wood tipped with a bit of iron. It was a killing machine, not for the soil, but for the oxen and the men pulling it. By 1860, the sulky plow appeared. For the first time, a farmer could sit down while he worked. To the traditionalist, this was lazy. To the economist, it was a revolution. A sitting farmer could work longer hours, cover more ground, and manage the massive 160-acre plots granted by the Homestead Act. The thresher, the village destroyer. Before the mid-19th century, separating grain from the stalk was a communal, winter-long task. You used a flail, 2 sticks joined by a chain, and beat the wheat on a barn floor. It was slow, dusty, and miserable. The arrival of the Pitts thresher changed the social fabric of America. These were massive stationary machines powered by horsepowers, literal circles of horses walking in a ring. Suddenly, the work of a whole village for a month could be done in an afternoon. This killed the need for large communal labor forces and shifted the power to the individual who owned the machine. The seed drill, precision over luck. For thousands of years, humans planted by broadcasting, literally throwing seeds by hand and hoping they landed in the right spot. It was incredibly wasteful. The mid-century saw the perfection of the mechanical seed drill. This machine used gears and tubes to drop seeds at exact intervals and exact depths. This wasn't just a convenience, it was a survival strategy. In the harsh, dry climates of the newly opened Western Territories, a seed planted too shallow would die in the sun. The seed drill ensured that the great American desert actually produced a harvest. The final transformation, the combine dream.
By 1890, the silhouette of the American West had changed. The horizon was no longer just a flat line of grass. It was broken by towering, windowless wooden skyscrapers that rose from the earth like the cathedrals of a new religion. These were the grain elevators. They were the physical manifestation of a massive shift in agricultural policy, the moment when the family farm became a cog in a global industrial machine. The invention of the vertical empire. Before the 1850s, grain was handled in bags. Men literally broke their backs carrying 100-pound sacks of wheat onto wagons and boats. It was slow, expensive, and human. But in 1842, a man named Joseph Dart in Buffalo, New York, applied the steam elevator principle to agriculture. Using a moving belt with buckets, he proved that grain could be handled like water, poured, pumped, and stored in massive vertical bins. By the 1870s, this technology had moved to the frontier. The railroad companies, fueled by federal land grants, refused to stop their trains for small farmers. They only stopped at the elevator. This created a brutal policy of centralization. If you didn't have access to an elevator, your grain was worthless. The policy of the invisible mix. Once a farmer's grain entered the elevator, it underwent a terrifying transformation. It lost its identity. Under the new grading policies established by the Chicago Board of Trade, your high-quality wheat was mixed with everyone else's grain of the same grade. This was the birth of the commodity market. The grain elevator owners, often owned by the same men who owned the railroads, became the lords of the prairie. They controlled the scales. They could tip the scales to show a farmer had delivered 90 bushels when he had actually delivered 100. This hidden theft became the fuel for a decade of rural rage. The line elevator versus the farmer elevator. The conflict became a war of infrastructure. Massive corporations built line elevators, strings of elevators along a single railroad line that they used to fix prices. If a farmer tried to protest, the line would simply refuse to buy his grain, letting it rot in the sun. In response, farmers used the cooperative policy we discussed earlier to build their own farmer elevators. This was a dangerous gamble. Railroads would often refuse to lay tracks to a farmer-owned elevator or accidentally lose the train cars meant for them. This was the front line of the American class war, not fought in the streets of New York, but on the wooden loading docks of Kansas and the Dakotas. The grain elevator as a weapon of war. Washington, D.C. realized that these elevators weren't just buildings, they were strategic assets. In the mid-century conflicts and the later push for global exports, the government used the elevator system to stockpile strategic reserves. The policy was clear. He who controls the elevator controls the price of bread in London, Paris, and Berlin. The grain elevator was the battery of the American economy. It stored the solar energy captured by the wheat and released it as cold, hard cash. But for the farmer standing in the shadow of that tower, the elevator was a reminder of his own shrinking power. He was a giant who grew the food, but he was a servant to the machine that moved it. The concrete legacy. By the turn of the century, the wooden line elevators began to be replaced by the massive concrete silos we see today. They became the skyscrapers of the plains. They stand as monuments to a 19th century policy that chose efficiency over independence. The American farmer had fed the world, but in doing so, he had built a system so large and so complex that he could no longer control it. The mid-19th century started with a man looking for a home. It ended with a nation looking for a market. The sentinels of the prairie still stand today, watching over a land that was conquered not just by the plow, but by the bucket elevator and the railroad switch. In the 1840s, a European farmer was the center of his own world. He grew his rye or wheat, sold it to the local village, and lived by the ancient laws of scarcity. But by the late 1870s and 1880s, the mid-century American policies, the Homestead Act,
the railroad land grants, and the mechanical reaper combined to create a food tsunami that crossed the Atlantic and shattered the old world order. This was the era of the Great Grain Invasion. The death of distance. For centuries, the Atlantic Ocean was a wall that protected European aristocrats and their peasant farmers from competition. It was simply too expensive to ship grain across the sea. But American policy had subsidized the creation of a massive infrastructure. The iron rails of the West met the steel hulls of the new transatlantic steamships. By 1880, it was actually cheaper to ship a bushel of wheat from Chicago to Liverpool than it was to transport it from a farm in central Germany to a city on the coast. The American policy of expansion in Washington, D.C. effectively deleted the Atlantic Ocean. The Great Price Collapse. When the massive harvests of the American West hit the European ports, the price of wheat plummeted by over 50%. For the American consumer, this was a golden age of cheap bread. For the European landlord, it was an apocalypse. In England, the landed gentry, the lords and dukes whose power came from owning grain-producing land, saw their wealth evaporate overnight. Their estates, which had been profitable for 1,000 years, became white elephants. The mid-century American farm policy didn't just grow wheat, it exported social revolution. It broke the back of the European aristocracy without firing a single shot. The peasant exodus. While the lords were losing their fortunes, the peasants were losing their livelihoods. They couldn't compete with the science of the American seed and the muscle of the steam thresher. This led to a massive policy reaction in Europe known as the marriage of iron and rye. Countries like Germany and France slapped massive tariffs on American grain to protect their own farmers, but it was too late. The peasants realized that if they couldn't beat the American farmer, they should join him. This triggered the largest migration in human history. Millions of people from Italy, Scandinavia, and Russia abandoned their ancestral lands, fueled by the dream of the 160-acre homestead. The birth of global diplomacy. The U.S. government realized that its agricultural policy was now its most powerful tool in foreign relations. When Russia faced a famine in 1891, the U.S. sent massive shipments of Midwest gold to feed the starving population. Food was no longer just a commodity, it was geopolitical leverage. The USDA began to function like a second State Department. They monitored the crop reports of India, Australia, and Argentina. If the rain failed in the Ukraine, American policy adjusted to flood those markets. The American farmer had become the quartermaster of the world. The shadow of success. But this global dominance had a dark side. By flooding the world with cheap grain, American policy had made the world dependent on a single source. It created a global monoculture where the health of the world's economy was tied to the weather in Kansas. The mid-19th century started with the humble goal of helping a few pioneers survive the winter. It ended with the United States holding the reins of the global food supply. The singing plow had sung a song that changed the fate of empires, moved millions across the sea, and established the United States as the indispensable nation of the coming 20th century. Chapter 22. The Guano Wars and the Hunt for White Gold. As the 1870s progressed, the American government realized a terrifying truth. The unlimited fertility of the West was a lie. Even the deep black loam of the prairies was starting to tire. To maintain the massive exports that were toppling European kings, the U.S. didn't just need more land, it needed nitrogen. This led to one of the strangest and most aggressive chapters in American agricultural policy, the global hunt for fertilizer, or as it was known then, white gold. The Guano Islands Act. Long before chemical fertilizers were invented in a lab, the world's most potent source of nitrogen was guano, the accumulated droppings of millions of seabirds off the coast of Peru. It was the fuel that powered the mid-century agricultural boom. In 1856, the U.S. Congress passed a radical law called the Guano Islands Act. This policy authorized any American citizen who discovered an island covered in bird droppings to claim it as U.S. territory. It was the first time the United States stepped outside its continental borders to grab land for the sake of its farmers. This was agricultural imperialism. Over 100 islands in the Pacific and Caribbean were annexed to ensure that the wheat fields of Ohio and the cotton fields of Georgia wouldn't run dry of nutrients. The blood for the soil. The hunt for fertilizer wasn't just a matter of logistics, it was a matter of war. In the late 1870s,
by the 1890s, a new and invisible battlefield had emerged in American agriculture. For centuries, a seed was a gift from nature or a trade between neighbors. But as the mid-19th century policies turned farming into a high-stakes industry, the idea of a plant became more valuable than the plant itself. This led to the Great Seed Wars, where the U.S. government had to decide, can a man own the blueprint of life? The policy of the free seed. Ironically, the biggest enemy of private seed companies was the U.S. government itself. In 1862, when Lincoln created the USDA, one of its primary missions was to give away free seeds to every farmer in America. By the 1890s, the USDA was mailing out over 1.1 billion packets of seeds a year for free. This was a massive socialist policy designed to ensure biodiversity. The government wanted farmers to experiment with new varieties of wheat and corn to see which survived the best. But for the emerging private seed corporations, this was unfair competition. They began to lobby Washington to stop the seed handouts, arguing that only private profit could drive the innovation needed for the 20th century. The rise of the plant patent. Inventors like Luther Burbank, the plant wizard, were creating miracle fruits and vegetables through crossbreeding, such as the russet Burbank potato, which still makes most of the world's French fries today. Burbank and others were furious that they could spend 10 years creating a new plum, only for a neighbor to take a cutting and grow their own for free. The legal policy of the time was stuck. The office argued that you could patent a machine, like a reaper, but you couldn't patent a product of nature. This led to a secret war of brand names. Companies couldn't own the seed, so they created elaborate, beautiful seed catalogs to sell the image of the perfect harvest. The seed spies and the theft of varieties. Because there was no international patent law for plants, American plant explorers, the seed spies we discussed in Chapter 15, would often travel to Russia or Turkey and steal local varieties that had been bred by peasants for 1,000 years. They would bring them back to the U.S., give them an American name, and claim them as discoveries. This biopiracy was a deliberate federal policy. The goal was to build a genetic fortress in America. By the time other nations realized their local seeds were being turned into American commodities, the U.S. had already used those genetics to dominate the global market. The Great Compromise. The tension between the USDA's free seed policy and the private company's patent dreams reached a breaking point. Eventually, the government began to pull back from the free handouts, shifting the policy towards protection. This transition laid the groundwork for the Plant Patent Act, which would come later, officially turning the American farm into a licensed laboratory. The farmer was no longer a seed saver. He was becoming a seed buyer. For the first time in history, a farmer had to go to a store to buy the very thing that used to fall for free from his own crops. The final transformation of the harvest. By the end of 1800, the policy of the seed had changed the American landscape into a giant patented grid. In 1840, there were thousands of local varieties of wheat. By 1900, the standardized grades and the patented seeds had narrowed the field to just a few dozen. This made the system incredibly efficient, but also incredibly fragile.
If a disease hit one of these standardized crops, it could wipe out the entire nation's food supply. The mid-19th century had started with a man and a wooden plow, trusting in the God-given fertility of the earth. It ended with a man and a ledger, calculating how many pounds of phosphate he could afford to buy to keep his land alive for one more year. As the clock struck midnight on the 19th century, the American farmer was no longer a person of the earth. They were a person of the network. The final agricultural policy shift of this era was the Great Convergence, the moment when electricity, internal combustion, and federal bureaucracy fused into a single system that would define the modern world. The death of the living motor. For 60 years, the American farm ran on hay power. In 1900, there were approximately 21 million horses and mules working American fields. This required a massive portion of the nation's land just to grow feed for the animals that worked the land. It was a circular, inefficient loop. But in the laboratories and machine shops of the Midwest, inventors were taking the principles of the steam engine and shrinking them. The policy of the USDA began to pivot away from better horses towards mechanical traction. By 1900, the first experimental gasoline-powered tractors were rattling across the soil. This was the final divorce from nature. A tractor didn't need to rest, it didn't eat 20% of your crop, and it didn't die of old age. The policy of the government became clear: replace the heart with the piston. The standardized American. Because of the Rural Free Delivery, RFD, and the Sears catalogs, the American farmer was now culturally indistinguishable from the city dweller. They wore the same factory-made boots, used the same branded soap, and read the same national newspapers. The agricultural policy had succeeded in its secret goal. It had turned the rugged, rebellious pioneer of 1840 into a consumer. The farmer was now a buyer of technology, a seller of commodities, and a taxpayer in a global empire. The independence of the Homestead Act had been traded for the convenience of the industrial age. The rise of the Department of Everything. By the turn of the century, the USDA had grown from a tiny seed distribution office into a shadow government. It had its own police, meat inspectors, its own spies, plant explorers, its own universities, land-grant colleges, and its own banks. As the 19th century breathed its last breath, a new and invisible force began to take control of the American soil. For 60 years, the American farm ran on hay power. In 1900, there were approximately 21 million horses and mules working American fields. This required a massive portion of the nation's land just to grow feed for the animals that worked the land. It was a circular, inefficient loop. But in the laboratories and machine shops of the Midwest, inventors were taking the principles of the steam engine and shrinking them. The policy of the USDA began to pivot away from better horses towards mechanical traction. By 1900, the first experimental gasoline-powered tractors were rattling across the soil. This was the final divorce from nature. A tractor didn't need to rest, it didn't eat 20% of your crop, and it didn't die of old age. The policy of the government became clear: replace the heart with the piston. The standardized American. Because of the Rural Free Delivery, RFD, and the Sears catalogs, the American farmer was now culturally indistinguishable from the city dweller. They wore the same factory-made boots, used the same branded soap, and read the same national newspapers. The agricultural policy had succeeded in its secret goal. It had turned the rugged, rebellious pioneer of 1840 into a consumer. The farmer was now a buyer of technology, a seller of commodities, and a taxpayer in a global empire. The independence of the Homestead Act had been traded for the convenience of the industrial age. The rise of the Department of Everything. By the turn of the century, the USDA had grown from a tiny seed distribution office into a shadow government. It had its own police, meat inspectors, its own spies, plant explorers, its own universities, land-grant colleges, and its own banks. As the 19th century breathed its last breath, a new and invisible force began to take control of the American soil. For 60 years, the American farm ran on hay power. In 1900, there were approximately 21 million horses and mules working American fields. This required a massive portion of the nation's land just to grow feed for the animals that worked the land. It was a circular, inefficient loop. But in the laboratories and machine shops of the Midwest, inventors were taking the principles of the steam engine and shrinking them. The policy of the USDA began to pivot away from better horses towards mechanical traction. By 1900, the first experimental gasoline-powered tractors were rattling across the soil. This was the final divorce from nature. A tractor didn't need to rest, it didn't eat 20% of your crop, and it didn't die of old age. The policy of the government became clear: replace the heart with the piston. The standardized American. Because of the Rural Free Delivery, RFD, and the Sears catalogs, the American farmer was now culturally indistinguishable from the city dweller. They wore the same factory-made boots, used the same branded soap, and read the same national newspapers. The agricultural policy had succeeded in its secret goal. It had turned the rugged, rebellious pioneer of 1840 into a consumer. The farmer was now a buyer of technology, a seller of commodities, and a taxpayer in a global empire. The independence,
The wire that walled the world. The barbed wire wars. By 1874, the grand experiment of the Homestead Act had hit a literal wall. The government had granted millions of acres to settlers, but in the vast, treeless expanse of the Great Plains, there was no way to mark where one man's dream ended and another's began. Without wood for fences, cattle roamed free, trampling the wheat of the sodbusters. This led to the final, most violent technological shift of the 19th century farm, the invention of barbed wire. The problem, the free-range conflict. In the early 1870s, the Western landscape was a theater of war between two types of agricultural policy. The cattle barons believed in the open range, the idea that the grass was public property and cows should roam wherever they pleased. The homesteaders believed in private property, the idea that 160 acres belonged to the family who farmed it. Because there were no trees to build fences, a farmer's entire year of work could be destroyed in a single night by a wandering herd of 5,000 steers. The farmer couldn't afford to build stone walls, and smooth wire was useless. The heavy cattle would simply lean on it until it snapped. The invention, the devil's rope. In 1874, a farmer named Joseph Glidden from DeKalb, Illinois, used a coffee mill to twist two wires together, trapping sharp metal barbs in between. He called it the winner. To the cattlemen, it was known as the devil's rope. This was not just a tool, it was a policy enforcer. Barbed wire allowed the federal government's grid system to become a reality. For the first time, a man could truly own the horizon. It was cheap, it was lightweight, and it was terrifyingly effective. The fence cutter wars. The introduction of barbed wire triggered a wave of violence across the West known as the fence cutter wars. Cattlemen, finding their ancient trails blocked by wire, formed masked night rider gangs. They rode out with wire cutters, destroying miles of fence in a single night. In Texas and New Mexico, blood was spilled over these metal borders. The government had to step in with new, harsh policies. In 1884, Texas made fence cutting a felony punishable by prison. This was the moment the Wild West died. The law had officially sided with the farmer over the cowboy.
The open range was dead, strangled by a wire that cost only pennies a foot. The ecological cage. The impact of this policy was felt far beyond the bank accounts of farmers. Barbed wire ended the migration of the buffalo and the nomadic way of life for indigenous nations. It also led to the big die-up mentioned in earlier chapters. When the blizzards of 1887 hit, the cattle couldn't move south to find warmth. They were trapped against the wire and froze to death by the millions. The legacy, the map of the modern world. By 1890, the American West was a silver spiderweb of wire. The policy of enclosure was complete. This transformed the American character. From communal to private, the land was no longer a shared resource, it was a commodity. From mobile to settled, the nomadic cowboy became a ranch hand who fixed fences. From nature to grid, the wild prairie was now a series of managed boxes. The mid-19th century had started with the hope of free land for all. It ended with that land wrapped in steel thorns. Barbed wire was the final sharp punctuation mark at the end of the frontier's history. It proved that in America, the only thing more powerful than the plow was the fence. Chapter 27. The Locust Apocalypse and the Policy of Despair. While the agricultural policy of the 1870s was focused on building railroads and shipping grain, nature launched a counteroffensive that nearly wiped out the American dream in the West. Between 1874 and 1877, a biblical plague descended on the homesteaders, the Rocky Mountain locust. This wasn't just a pest, it was a biological wildfire that forced the U.S. government to realize that owning land was meaningless if you couldn't defend it from the sky. The year of the hopper, 1874. In the summer of 1874, the sky over Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas suddenly turned dark at noon. A shimmering metallic cloud, some reports say it was 1,800 miles long and 110 miles wide, blocked out the sun. It was a swarm of billions of locusts. When they landed, the sound was described as a roaring fire. They didn't just eat the wheat and corn, they ate the wool off the sheep's backs, the handles off the wooden pitchforks, and even the clothes off the lines. In a matter of hours, a family's entire life's work, guaranteed by the Homestead Act, was reduced to bare brown dirt. The policy of eat or starve. The disaster was so total that it triggered a national crisis. For the first time, the federal government had to decide if agricultural policy included disaster relief. Initially, the government hesitated. They believed in rugged individualism, that the farmer should survive on his own. But as tens of thousands of families began to flee back east, threatening to leave the new railroads with no customers and the banks with no mortgage payments, the policy shifted. Congress was forced to pass the Relief Act of 1875, providing $150,000 for seeds and food for the starving settlers. It was the first time the U.S. military was deployed not to fight a war, but to distribute rations to American farmers. The Great Bounty and the Hopper Dozer. Desperate farmers tried everything. Some states passed grasshopper laws requiring every able-bodied man to spend 2 days a week killing insects or pay a fine. They invented the Hopper Dozer, a long horse-drawn sled filled with coal tar. As it moved through the fields, the locusts would jump and get stuck in the tar, which was then set on fire. The USDA, led by entomologist Charles Valentine Riley, began a scientific crusade. Riley traveled into the heart of the plague, studying the locust's life cycle. He realized that the policy of killing them on the farm was useless. the government had to find their breeding grounds in the high mountains and destroy them there. The mystery of the vanishing plague. Then, as suddenly as they arrived, the locusts vanished. By the late 1880s, the Rocky Mountain locust, the greatest threat to the American farm, went completely extinct. The agricultural policy of the settlers had accidentally won. By plowing the unplowable edges of the mountains and introducing cattle that trampled the riverbeds where the locusts laid their eggs, the farmers had unintentionally destroyed the species' habitat. It is the only time in human history that a major pest was wiped out by sheer accident of industry. The legacy, the birth of the safety net. The locust apocalypse taught Washington a hard lesson. The farm was part of a fragile ecosystem. You couldn't just give a man 160 acres and wish him luck. This era birthed the idea of crop insurance and federal emergency management. The mid-19th century had started with the dream of a pioneer paradise. The locusts proved that the paradise was a jungle that required the full weight of the federal government to survive. The American farmer was no longer an island. He was now a ward of the state in times of ecological war. Chapter 28: The Bonanza Kings and the Industrialization of the Horizon. By the late 1870s, the federal government's dream of a nation of small family farmers was being challenged by a new, massive phenomenon, the bonanza farm. If the Homestead Act was about the small 160-acre plot, the bonanza farm was about the 50,000-acre empire. This was the moment agricultural policy collided with Wall Street, and the result was a scale of production the world had never seen. The Great Northern Handoff. The bonanza farms were born from a crisis. When the Northern Pacific Railroad neared bankruptcy in 1873, it paid off its creditors with the only thing it had, millions of acres of land granted to it by the government. Large investors like Oliver Dalprom realized that if they combined these massive tracts of land, they could apply the same logic as a textile factory or a steel mill to the soil of the Red River Valley.
Chapter 32: The Axe and the Law, the Birth of the American Forest Policy. By the late 1880s, the agricultural policy of the United States hit a jagged wooden obstacle. For 50 years, the government had treated trees like weeds, obstacles that stood in the way of the plow. But as the pioneers pushed into the Great Lakes region and the Pacific Northwest, they didn't just find woods, they found the great green gold. The frantic, unregulated hacking of these forests created an environmental crisis that forced the birth of conservation policy. The era of the cut and run. In the 1870s, the policy was simple: exploitation. Lumber companies bought up federal land for pennies an acre, clear-cut every standing tree, and then abandoned the land, the cut-and-run method. They moved like a locust swarm of steel axes. In Michigan alone, the white pine forests that had stood for millennia were virtually erased in a single generation. The wood was needed for everything: the ties for the railroads, the frames for the balloon frame houses in Chicago, and the millions of fence posts for the new barbed wire. But the cost was devastating. Without trees to hold the soil and slow the water, the Midwest began to experience flash floods and massive soil erosion. The very agricultural paradise the government had promised was literally washing away into the rivers. The Timber Culture Act, 1873. Washington, D.C. realized it had a climate problem. Scientists at the time believed in the theory that rain follows the plow, and that trees could actually create rain. To combat the treeless heat of the Great Plains, Congress passed the Timber Culture Act.
This policy allowed a homesteader to claim an additional 160 acres of land if they promised to plant trees on at least 40 of them. It was the first green subsidy in American history. The government wasn't just giving away land, it was trying to re-engineer the atmosphere of the continent. The rise of the forest reserves. By 1891, the public's mood had shifted from exploit to protect. The reckless logging had led to massive forest fires, like the Pestigo fire, that killed thousands. In response, Congress passed the Forest Reserve Act. This was a massive pivot in policy. For the first time, the president, starting with Benjamin Harrison and later Theodore Roosevelt, had the power to set aside land and say no. No plows, no axes, no private ownership. This was the birth of the National Forest System. It established the idea that the common good was more important than individual profit. The science of silviculture. With the new forests came the need for a new type of expert, a forester. Just as the land-grant colleges created scientific farmers, they now began to churn out scientific woodsmen. Men like Gifford Pinchot traveled to Europe to study how to harvest trees without killing the forest. Pinchot's philosophy became the official U.S. policy, the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. This was a middle ground between total destruction and total preservation. The forest was to be a crop that was harvested slowly and replanted, ensuring that the American farm would always have the wood it needed to survive. The legacy, the managed wilderness. By 1900, the wild woods were gone. In their place was a managed landscape. The American forest was now part of a federal bureaucracy. This policy change saved the American watershed and ensured that the West wouldn't turn into a desert. The mid-19th century had started with the axe as a symbol of progress, a tool to conquer the dark, scary woods. It ended with the ranger as a symbol of wisdom, a guardian to protect the trees that made the farm possible. The American landscape was no longer a victim of the people. It was now a ward of the state. Chapter 33. The War for Every Drop. The Rise of the Irrigation Empire. By the 1990s, the American agricultural dream had run into a hard, dry reality, the 100th meridian. This invisible longitudinal line, cutting through the Dakotas down to Texas, marked the boundary where rainfall dropped below 20 inches a year, the minimum required to grow crops without help. East of the line was the Green Empire. West of it was the Great American Desert. The federal government's policy of giving away 160-acre plots worked in the rain-soaked East, but in the West, 160 acres without water was just a graveyard. This forced a total rewrite of American law, shifting the focus from land rights to water rights. The death of the riparian doctrine. Back east, the law followed the English riparian doctrine, which said that if you owned land next to a river, you owned the right to use that water, provided you didn't diminish it for your neighbor. In the dry West, this policy was useless. If you only allowed people next to the river to use the water, 99% of the land would be a desert. Out of the chaos of the California gold rush and the Nevada silver mines, a new, brutal policy emerged: prior appropriation, or first in time, first in right. It didn't matter if you lived on the river or 10 miles away. If you were the first person to divert the water into a ditch, you owned that water forever. The irrigation district and the watermeister. Because a single farmer couldn't afford to build a dam or a 20-mile canal, the government created a new political entity, the irrigation district. These were essentially water republics. Groups of farmers were given the power to tax themselves and issue bonds to build massive infrastructure. Suddenly, the most important man in the county wasn't the sheriff or the judge. It was the watermaster, He held the keys to the head gates. He decided who ate and who starved. This created a new social hierarchy. In the West, wealth wasn't measured in gold or even land. It was measured in acre-feet of water. The Powell Report and the Federal Pivot. In 1878, John Wesley Powell, a one-armed Civil War veteran who had mapped the Grand Canyon, issued a prophetic report to Congress. He warned that the Homestead Act was a disaster for the West. He argued that the 160-acre square grid was a lie in a dry land, and that the government should organize the West by watersheds, not squares. Congress ignored him for decades, but by 1902, the failures of dry land farming were so great that they finally passed the Newlands Reclamation Act. This was the ultimate big government agricultural policy. The federal government would now build the massive dams like the future Hoover Dam and the 1,000-mile canals. The small farmer was now a federal tenant dependent on a massive government-managed plumbing system to stay alive. The Orange Gold Revolution. Irrigation changed what America grew. Without rain, but with canal water and constant sun, California and Arizona became the winter gardens of the world. They didn't grow wheat or corn. They grew high-value crops like oranges, lemons, and grapes. The Sun-Kissed Cooperative was born in this era. They used the new irrigation policies and the refrigerated rail cars from Chapter 31 to turn the desert into a luxury fruit factory. The American agricultural policy of the United States had successfully conquered the climate. The legacy, the liquid mortgage. By the turn of the century, the West was no longer wild, it was plumbed. Every river was measured, every drop was owned, and every stream was redirected. The mid-19th century had started with the belief that nature was a gift to be taken. It ended with the realization that in the West, nature was a machine that had to be managed. The pioneer was now an irrigator, a man who lived and died by the schedule of the canal, proving that in the American West, water is thicker than blood. Chapter 34. The Billion-Dollar Bug, the Boll Weevil, and the Death of the Old South. While the West was battling drought and locusts, the American South was facing a biological invasion that would do more to dismantle the Old South than even the Civil War had. In 1892, a tiny specialized beetle crossed the Rio Grande from Mexico into Texas. It was the boll weevil, and it was about to force a total revolution in American agricultural policy, shifting the South from a single crop kingdom to a modern, diversified economy. The policy of the single crop. After the Civil War, the Southern economy was rebuilt on a precarious foundation, sharecropping and tenant farming. The policy of the banks and the landowners was cotton or nothing. Because cotton was a non-perishable cash crop that could be sold globally, the entire financial system of the South was locked into a monoculture.
By the 1880s, the American agricultural policy had shifted from how do we get people to the land to how do we make the land work faster. The answer was unveiled at the massive state fairs and exhibitions that became the cathedrals of progress for the prairie. These were not just carnivals, they were the proving grounds where the muscle of the horse was officially challenged by the power of fire and water. The Duel of the Decades. In 1881, at a massive exhibition in the Midwest, the government and private industry staged a duel of power. On one side of a 40-acre field stood 20 of the finest Percheron draft horses, their muscles rippling under polished leather harnesses. On the other side stood a single, massive steam traction engine, belching thick coal smoke and hissing with the pent-up energy of a locomotive. The challenge was simple. Who could plow a straight line through the heavy, unbroken gumbo soil the fastest? The horses moved with grace, but they grew tired.
They lathered in the sun and needed water. The steam engine, however, did not tire. As long as it had coal and a steady supply of water, it moved with an unstoppable, crushing force. The birth of the engineers of the earth. This fair marked a psychological shift in federal policy. The USDA and the land-grant colleges began to realize that the farmer of the future wouldn't just be a husbandman of animals, but a mechanic of iron. New policies were enacted to create mechanical engineering departments within agricultural schools. The government began to subsidize the development of gang plows, massive rigs that could pull 10 or 12 blades at once. This meant that one man, sitting atop a vibrating, steaming throne of iron, could do the work that previously required 20 men and 40 horses. The steam threshing fever. The steam engine didn't just plow, it powered the threshing machine. Before this, separating grain from the stalk was a slow, agonizing process of flailing by hand or using small horse-powered treadmills. The steam-powered thresher turned this into an industrial explosion. These machines were so large and expensive that they created a new social policy, the threshing ring. A dozen neighbors would pool their money to hire a custom harvester who traveled with a steam engine. The farm became a high-stakes logistics hub. If the steam engine broke down, the entire local economy ground to a halt. If the boiler exploded, which happened with terrifying frequency, it could level a barn and kill a dozen men instantly. The high cost of the fire horse. While the steam engine made the harvest faster, it introduced a new agricultural policy problem: infrastructure. These 10-ton machines were too heavy for the wooden bridges of the era. Farmers began to petition the government for good roads and steel bridges. The steam engine also demanded capital. You couldn't grow a tractor the way you could breed a horse. You had to buy it from a company like Case or Deere. This pushed the American farmer into a permanent relationship with the bank. The policy of the 19th century had successfully turned the pioneer into a consumer of technology. The legacy, the mechanical horizon. The great fairs of the 1880s proved that the American farm was no longer a quiet pastoral place. It was a place of noise, smoke, and industrial speed. The steam revolution was the bridge between the age of the animal and the age of the gasoline engine. The mid-19th century had started with a man walking behind a single blade in a silent field. It was ending with a man commanding a giant of steel and fire that could consume a prairie in a day. The American horizon was no longer something to be feared, it was something to be processed. By the late 1880s, the American West had produced a surplus so massive that the old ways of storing food, sacks, barrels, and wooden barns, were physically bursting. The federal government's policy of maximum production had succeeded too well. To handle this ocean of wheat, a new type of architecture was required. This led to the rise of the grain elevator, the skyscraper of the plains, which changed the very nature of food from a physical crop into a digital commodity. The gravity revolution. Before the 1850s, moving grain was a back-breaking human labor. Men carried 100-pound sacks on their shoulders from wagons to boats. But in 1842, a man named Joseph Dart in Buffalo, New York, applied steam power to a vertical belt of buckets. He realized that grain in bulk behaves like a liquid. By the 1880s, these Dart elevators had moved into every railroad town in the West. A farmer would pull his wagon onto a scale, a trapdoor would open, and his entire harvest would disappear into a dark pit, only to be whisked upward by steam-powered buckets into massive bins. This was the policy of verticality. Using gravity to load railroad cars, the time it took to ship a harvest dropped from days to minutes. The loss of the single seed. The most profound policy shift happened inside the elevator's bins. Before this, a farmer sold his specific wheat to a specific baker. But the elevator system required standardization. Under the new grading policies established by the Chicago Board of Trade, grain was inspected and binned by quality. Number 1, hard winter wheat, number 2, spring wheat, etc. Once the farmer's grain hit the bin, it was mixed with the grain of 1,000 other farmers. He no longer owned his wheat, he owned a warehouse receipt. This piece of paper represented a value, not a physical object. This was the birth of the commodity market. The American agricultural policy had successfully turned life-sustaining food into liquid capital. The monopoly of the line. As the railroads expanded, they refused to stop at small farms. They would only stop at the elevators. This gave birth to the line elevator companies, massive corporations that built a string of elevators along a single railroad line. These companies became the gatekeepers of the prairie. Because the government had given the railroads the land, and the railroads owned the elevators, the farmer was trapped. The line companies would often undergrade a farmer's wheat or short-weight his wagon. If the farmer complained, they would refuse to buy his grain at all, leaving it to rot. This sparked a new wave of political fury that would lead to the Granger Laws, the first time the Supreme Court ruled that the government could regulate private business for the public good. The architecture of power. The grain elevator became the center of the western town. It was the tallest building for 100 miles, visible long before the town itself. It was the bank vault of the community. In years of bonanza harvests, the elevators were filled, the railroads were humming, and the towns were rich. In years of drought, the empty, hollow towers stood like ghosts, haunting the families who had lost everything. The legacy, the global feed. By 1890, the elevator system allowed the United States to feed the world. A loaf of bread in London was now made from a mixture of wheat that had passed through an elevator in Kansas and another in Buffalo. The mid-19th century had started with the goal of self-sufficiency, growing enough to feed your family. It ended with integration, growing a nameless, faceless commodity for a global machine. The American farmer had become a specialized worker in a continental factory, and the elevator was the machine that made it all possible. Chapter 31, The Icebox on Wheels, the Beef Barons and the Cold Chain Revolution. By the 1880s, American agricultural policy faced a biological wall. The Great Plains were overflowing with cattle, but the massive consumer markets were in the east. For decades, the only way to get beef to New York or Boston was the live drive, cramming thousands of terrified, screaming animals into slatted rail cars for a week-long journey. By the time they arrived, the cattle were bruised, dehydrated, and had lost 10% of their weight. It was a policy of waste. The beef barons of Chicago, men like Gustav Swift and Philip Armour, realized that they were paying the railroads to ship bones, hides, and hooves that no one back east wanted to buy. Their vision was radical. Slaughter the cattle in Chicago, pack the meat into rail cars, and ship only the profitable cuts. But there was one major obstacle: rot. In the sweltering heat of an American summer, raw beef would turn into a biohazard within 48 hours. The railroads, who made a fortune charging for the weight of live cattle, laughed at the idea of refrigerated transport. They refused to build the cars. The invention, the Swift refrigerator car. Gustav Swift didn't wait for the railroads. He hired an engineer named Andrew Chase to design a mobile icebox. They developed a system where tanks of ice and brine were placed at the ends of the car. Because cold air is heavier than warm air, it would circulate down and through the hanging carcasses, kept in motion by the rocking of the train. In 1878, the first successful shipment of chilled beef reached the East Coast. It was a revolution.
By the 1880s, the American agricultural policy had shifted from how do we get people to the land to how do we make the land work faster.
The answer was unveiled at the massive state fairs and exhibitions that became the cathedrals of progress for the prairie. These were not just carnivals, they were the proving grounds where the muscle of the horse was officially challenged by the power of fire and water. The Duel of the Decades. In 1881, at a massive exhibition in the Midwest, the government and private industry staged a duel of power. On one side of a 40-acre field stood 20 of the finest Percheron draft horses, their muscles rippling under polished leather harnesses. On the other side stood a single massive steam traction engine, belching thick black coal smoke and hissing with the pent-up energy of a locomotive. The challenge was simple. Who could plow a straight line through the heavy, unbroken gumbo soil the fastest? The horses moved with grace, but they grew tired. They lathered in the sun and needed water. The steam engine, however, did not tire. As long as it had coal and a steady supply of water, it moved with an unstoppable, crushing force. The birth of the engineers of the earth. This fair marked a psychological shift in federal policy. The USDA and the land-grant colleges began to realize that the farmer of the future wouldn't just be a husbandman of animals, but a mechanic of iron. New policies were enacted to create mechanical engineering departments within agricultural schools. The government began to subsidize the development of gang plows, massive rigs that could pull 10 or 12 blades at once. This meant that one man, sitting atop a vibrating, steaming throne of iron, could do the work that previously required 20 men and 40 horses. The steam threshing fever. The steam engine didn't just plow, it powered the threshing machine. Before this, separating grain from the stalk was a slow, agonizing process of flailing by hand or using small horse-powered treadmills. The steam-powered thresher turned this into an industrial explosion. These machines were so large and expensive that they created a new social policy, the threshing ring. A dozen neighbors would pool their money to hire a custom harvester who traveled with a steam engine. The farm became a high-stakes logistics hub. If the steam engine broke down, the entire local economy ground to a halt. If the boiler exploded, which happened with terrifying frequency, it could level a barn and kill a dozen men instantly. The high cost of the fire horse. While the steam engine made the harvest faster, it introduced a new agricultural policy problem: infrastructure. These 10-ton machines were too heavy for the wooden bridges of the era. Farmers began to petition the government for good roads and steel bridges. The steam engine also demanded capital. You couldn't grow a tractor the way you could breed a horse. You had to buy it from a company like Case or Deere. This pushed the American farmer into a permanent relationship with the bank. The policy of the 19th century had successfully turned the pioneer into a consumer of technology. The legacy, the mechanical horizon. The great fairs of the 1880s proved that the American farm was no longer a quiet, pastoral place. It was a place of noise, smoke, and industrial speed. The steam revolution was the bridge between the age of the animal and the age of the gasoline engine. The mid-19th century had started with a man walking behind a single blade in a silent field. It was ending with a man commanding a giant of steel and fire that could consume a prairie in a day. The American horizon was no longer something to be feared, it was something to be processed. By the late 1880s, the American West had produced a surplus so massive that the old ways of storing food, sacks, barrels, and wooden barns, were physically bursting. The federal government's policy of maximum production had succeeded too well. To handle this ocean of wheat, a new type of architecture was required. This led to the rise of the grain elevator, the skyscraper of the plains, which changed the very nature of food from a physical crop into a digital commodity. The gravity revolution. Before the 1850s, moving grain was a back-breaking human labor. Men carried 100-pound sacks on their shoulders from wagons to boats. But in 1842, a man named Joseph Dart in Buffalo, New York,
applied steam power to a vertical belt of buckets, he realized that grain, in bulk, behaves like a liquid. By the 1880s, these DART elevators had moved into every railroad town in the West. A farmer would pull his wagon onto a scale, a trap door would open, and his entire harvest would disappear into a dark pit, only to be whisked upward by steam-powered buckets into massive bins. This was the policy of verticality. By using gravity to load railroad cars, the time it took to ship a harvest dropped from days to minutes. The loss of the single seed. The most profound policy shift happened inside the elevator's bins. Before this, a farmer sold his specific wheat to a specific baker, but the elevator system required standardization. Under the new grading policies established by the Chicago Board of Trade, grain was inspected and binned by quality. Number 1 hard winter wheat, number 2 spring wheat. Once the farmer's grain hit the bin, it was mixed with the grain of 1,000 other farmers. He no longer owned his wheat, he owned a warehouse receipt. This piece of paper represented a value, not a physical object. This was the birth of the commodity market. The American agricultural policy had successfully turned life-sustaining food into liquid capital. The monopoly of the line. As the railroads expanded, they refused to stop at small farms. They would only stop at the elevators. This gave birth to the line elevator companies, massive corporations that built a string of elevators along a single railroad line. These companies became the gatekeepers of the prairie. Because the government had given the railroads the land and the railroads owned the elevators, the farmer was trapped. The line companies would often undergrade a farmer's wheat or short weight his wagon. If the farmer complained, they would refuse to buy his grain at all, leaving it to rot. This sparked a new wave of political fury that would lead to the Granger Laws, the first time the Supreme Court ruled that the government could regulate private business for the public good. The architecture of power. The grain elevator became the center of the western town. It was the tallest building for 100 miles, visible long before the town itself. It was the bank vault of the community. In years of bonanza harvests, the elevators were full, the railroads were humming, and the towns were rich. In years of drought, the empty, hollow towers stood like ghosts, haunting the families who had lost everything. By 1900, the American agricultural policy had been almost too successful. The United States was producing a staggering amount of food, and the industrial giants of Chicago and St. Louis were processing it at lightning speed. But there was a dark side to this efficiency policy. In the race to lower costs and maximize shelf life, the food reaching the American dinner table had become a chemical minefield. This led to the final great policy battle of the era, the birth of the USDA Food Police. The era of better living through chemistry, the wrong way. Before 1906, there were virtually no federal laws governing what could be put into food. To make rotting meat look fresh, packers used preservaline, which was a mix of borax and formaldehyde. To make cheap glucose look like strawberry jam, they used coal tar dyes and literal sawdust for seeds. The government's laissez-faire, or hands-off policy, had created a marketplace where the honest farmer couldn't compete with the dishonest chemist. If a farmer produced pure butter, he was being driven out of business by oleomargarine, made of beef scraps and dyed yellow with toxic minerals. The Poison Squad experiments. The hero of this shift was Dr. Harvey Wiley, the chief chemist of the USBA. In 1902, he launched one of the strangest government policies in history, the Poison Squad. He recruited young, healthy men to eat meals laced with common food preservatives of the time, borax, salicylic acid, and formaldehyde, to see what they did to the human body. The results were horrifying. The squad suffered from constant nausea, stomach pains, and organ damage. The public followed the news daily, and the policy of secrecy in the food industry began to crumble. Americans realized that the agricultural miracle was being poisoned at the factory gate. The Upton Jungle and the 1906 Act. The final push came from the world of literature. Upton Sinclair published The Jungle in 1906. While he intended to write about the plight of workers, the public was more horrified by his descriptions of rats being ground into sausage and potted ham made of unmentionable scraps. President Teddy Roosevelt, a man who believed in the square deal, realized that agricultural policy had to include consumer protection. In 1840, you knew the farmer who grew your food. In 1900, your food came from a nameless factory. Therefore, the government had to become the eyes of the consumer. The Pure Food and Drug Act, 1906. This landmark law changed the role of the USDA forever.
As 1919 dawned, the American farmer was at the pinnacle of his power. Prices were at record highs, and the government had begged for every bushel of wheat to feed a starving post-war Europe. But a trap was being set. The very success policies we've tracked for 37 chapters, the mechanization, the irrigation, and the chemical fertilizers, had created a monster that the government didn't know how to handle: the perpetual surplus. The price cliff of 1920. During the war, the government's policy was to guarantee high prices to encourage production. Farmers, believing the boom would last forever, took out massive loans to buy more land and the new gasoline-powered tractors. But when the war ended and European farms began to recover, the global demand for wheat cratered. In 18 months, the price of wheat dropped from $2.50 a bushel to less than $1. The agricultural policy of the previous century had been built on the idea that more is better. Suddenly, more was a death sentence. The farmer was producing so much food that he was making himself poor. The rise of the farm bloc. This crisis gave birth to a new political force in Washington, the farm bloc. For the first time, congressmen from the Midwest and South organized into a single union to force the government to protect the farmer from the free market. They realized that the old policy, giving away land, was dead. The new policy had to be price support. They began to lobby for the McNary-Haugen Farm Relief Act, which proposed that the government should buy up the surplus grain and sell it overseas at a loss just to keep the domestic price high. It was a radical idea. The government would now act as the buyer of last resort. The tractorization of the plains. Despite the falling prices, farmers didn't stop producing. In fact, they produced more to try and pay off their debts. To do this, they replaced their last remaining horses with the general-purpose tractor. The gasoline engine was the final nail in the coffin of the old world. A tractor didn't need to eat a portion of the crop, it just needed fuel. This allowed the farmer to plow up the marginal lands, the dry, sandy areas of the panhandle that were held down only by a thin layer of buffalo grass. The government's policy of maximum land use was officially pushing the environment to its breaking point. The debt cycle policy. Because the government had encouraged the banks to lend money for modernization, the American farm was now a leveraged asset. If the farmer didn't have a record-breaking harvest, he couldn't pay the interest on his tractor. If he did have a record-breaking harvest, the price dropped. This scissors crisis, rising costs versus falling prices, became the permanent state of American agriculture. The policy of the mid-19th century had been about opportunity. The policy of the early 20th century was about survival. The legacy, the engine of the Great Depression. Most history books say the Great Depression started with the stock market crash in 1929, but for the American farmer, the Depression started in 1920. The agricultural sector, the largest part of the economy, was in a state of collapse for a full decade before the rest of the country. The policy of expansion had reached the edge of the map. There was no more land to give, no more water to divert, and no more markets to conquer.
The American farmer was now the victim of his own incredible efficiency. The end of the 19th century cycle. We have now reached the literal end of the era. The policies we've discussed, from the steel plow to the tractor, built a world of abundance, but that abundance became a burden. Your video series conclusion, the final scene of your series, should show a farmer standing in a field of wheat that is taller and thicker than his ancestors ever dreamed of. Yet, he is holding a foreclosure notice from the bank. This is the ultimate irony of American agricultural policy. We learned how to conquer nature, but we didn't learn how to manage our own success. As we reach the early 1920s, the success policies of the previous century finally collided with the laws of nature. The federal government had spent 80 years encouraging the great plow-up, but they had failed to account for a fundamental geographic truth. The Great Plains were never meant to be a permanent wheat factory. This chapter explores the policy of overextension that set the stage for the greatest man-made ecological disaster in history. The myth of the inexhaustible soil. For decades, the USDA and the land-grant colleges had preached that the American soil was a machine that could be tuned for infinite production. The policy was simple. If the yield drops, add more chemicals. If the price drops, plow more land. By 1924, there were 2 million tractors in the United States. These machines allowed a single farmer to rip up the deep-rooted short-grass prairie that had held the soil in place for 10,000 years. The buffalo grass, which was a natural armor against the wind, was replaced by rows of wheat. The suitcase farmer policy. Because the government had made it so easy to claim and plow land, a new breed of agriculturalist emerged, the suitcase farmer. These were city dwellers, lawyers, bankers, and speculators who bought land in the dry regions of Kansas and Colorado. They would drive out in a car, hire a tractor crew to plow and seed thousands of acres in a few days, and then leave. This was industrial mining disguised as farming. There was no policy of stewardship. If the crop failed, the suitcase farmer lost a little money and moved on. But they left behind millions of acres of raw, exposed soil with no roots to hold it down. The first black blizzards. In the mid-1920s, a series of small, localized droughts hit. The wind began to pick up the topsoil from these suitcase plots. For the first time, people saw brown snow, soil from the plains blowing hundreds of miles and falling on the cities of the east. The government's response was a policy of denial. They kept telling farmers that rain follows the plow and that the drought was just a temporary fluke. They didn't realize that they had created a biological bomb. By removing the grass and drying out the soil through constant plowing, they had turned the heart of the country into a giant pile of dust. The mechanical trap. The farmer was now in a mechanical trap. He had to pay for the tractor, the gasoline, and the specialized seeds. To get the money, he had to produce more wheat. To produce more wheat, he had to plow more marginal land. The government's credit policy was fueling the destruction. Banks were only lending money to farmers who used modern, i.e. destructive methods. The old, sustainable ways of the small 160-acre homestead were being mocked as obsolete. The legacy, the warning ignored. By 1929, the stage was set. The soil was powder, the grass was gone, the debts were high, the global economy was shaking. The agricultural policy of the 19th century, which was based on conquest and extraction, had finally reached its limit. The mid-19th century had started with the goal of turning the desert into a garden. It was ending with the terrifying reality of turning the garden back into the desert. Conclusion of the saga. From dirt to dust. We have followed the American agricultural policy from the first steel plow in 1837 to the edge of the Dust Bowl in 1929. The full arc: exploration, mapping the potential; enclosure, giving the land away, Homestead Act; industrialization, replacing muscle with steam and gas; standardization, turning food into a global commodity; exhaustion, pushing the biology of the earth too far.